everyone. My name's Laura Cavers. I'm the reader advisor at New Canaan Library. Tonight we have Nancy Pearl. She is our author of the night. She has written a book, The Writer's Library, and it's a book that is about, that she interviews, she and another colleague of hers, Jeff Schwager, who is not with us tonight. They went around the country and asked writers what books influenced them, either when they were children or even in their writing. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. Nancy Pearl is a best-selling author, a librarian, and literary critic. You can hear her on NPR's Morning Edition discussing her favorite books. She also hosts a monthly TV show, Book Lust with Nancy Pearl. That takes place in Seattle. It's a Seattle television show. Is that correct? Yes. She is the creator of the internationally recognized program, If All of Seattle Read the Same Book, which is why many libraries in the world today have community read programs, like the celebration that we did here at New Canaan Library, One Author New Canaan with Jacqueline Woodson in March. She has won the Librarian of the Year in 2011 and has a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association. And she is the only librarian that has an action figure, and I've seen it. There's actually two of them, one with a cape and one without a cape. Her first novel, George and Lizzie, was published in 2017. Welcome, Nancy. Thank you so much for being here at the Author Talk at New Canaan Library. How are you today?
I am fine, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. I always love to talk to library groups because I'm a librarian.
You are one of the most celebrated librarians.
Thank you.
You are. So right off the bat in Writer's Library, in the foreword, Susan Orlean writes the very first line, and it just took my breath away. And the line was, in Senegal, when someone dies, you say that his or her library has burned. And I just thought, oh my gosh, what an amazing concept.
Yeah.
I think of it as, you know, all my relatives, like, yes, they're treasure troves of just what they have inside of them. Is that how you feel about the books, the libraries?
It is. It is a feeling. I mean, I've never heard it expressed the way Susan Orlean expressed it when she wrote that introduction to the Writer's Library. And, you know, we had wanted Susan Orlean to be one of the authors that we interviewed, but we were doing the interviews in person. And every time we were on the East Coast, Susan Orlean was on the West Coast. And every time we were on the West Coast, she was on the East Coast. So we could never connect for an interview. So we asked her if she would please write an introduction for us. And it begins with that fabulous idea that when someone dies, their library dies with them. And I just think that is the kind of sentence that really you want to discuss. I mean, you know, because you can take it in all of these different ways. And certainly all of the authors that Jeff Schwager and I interviewed, who they are at the moment that we interviewed is made up of many things, but part of those are all the books that they've read and loved. And I think that's what makes reading the Writer's Library, reading the interviews, partly that makes it so much fun to read, because you can see a writer whose work you love, Dave Eggers, say, or Louise Erdrich, and then you read about their reading experiences, what they loved as a child, what they read now. It just puts the authors in this sort of a common humanity with all of us readers, and I loved that. I just thought that was the best part of doing these interviews, was talking to these writers, not about what they've written, but about what they've read.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see some of their, some of them, it was all about the sentence structures. they were reading it like, and that's why they were reading or others were influenced by, how they were framing a thought. And yes, that is something that's wonderful about the Writers' Library. Now, I did a little research. I was actually watching some other recordings of you and Jeff talking with a number of other people. And this was supposed to be a coffee table book.
Yes.
And so how did everything kind of change?
Well, this whole idea for the Writers' Library is due to totally Jeff's idea. I published my first novel in 2017. I keep thinking about doing another one, but Jeff, who I met when he interviewed me for a project he was doing in Seattle, we immediately hit it off. He's like a younger brother to me. We hit it off because it was so clear we love to read. Both of us love to read. Both of us love telling the other person what they ought to read and all of that. And so Jeff and I were having lunch one day in Seattle, and he said, I have this idea for a book. I thought it would be fun to do a coffee table book of writers' libraries, their home libraries. And, he said, wouldn't that be fun? We could do it together. And I said, I'm not the kind of person, I'm not a coffee table book kind of person. I said, I would love to go interview them about what they've read. And if we see their libraries in their homes, so much the better. And then I went home and called my agent, Victoria Sanders in New York. And I said, Victoria, here's an idea. I said I didn't want to do a coffee table book. She said, no coffee table books, Nancy. She said, but those interviews about what authors love to read, what they read as children, she said, that's a great idea. I think you ought to go for it.
Now, just to let the viewers know, Jeff Schwager is a playwright, and he's a Seattle-based writer, editor, producer, and playwright. So he comes kind of with a different set of eyes when he's talking with writers. And,
Yeah.
Now, you had to go around the country to meet these writers, and some of them, not all, invited you into their homes.
Right.
And how special was that?
Oh my gosh, Laura, it was just amazing. And, really the majority of the writers did invite us into their homes. Let's see, Tom Boyle, T. Cora Gesson Boyle, who lives in Montecito, California, said, come for lunch. And he lives in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, the first prairie style Frank Lloyd Wright home built west of the Mississippi. He took us around, he showed us his library. We would stand in front of his bookshelves and I would say, oh, I loved that book. And Tom would say, oh, I loved it too. And Jeff would say, oh, I guess I better read that. Or Jeff would say, oh, this is my favorite book. And Tom would say, oh, I love that book too. And so, that was wonderful. Amor Towles' home in New York in Gramercy Park was pretty special. Amor, we went upstairs to
quite a library of books.
Library of books, indeed. And Amor, I have to say, if anybody listening has not ever heard him speak, and he's in the area, just go hear him speak. He speaks in complete paragraphs, and I loved our discussion with him so much. Jane Hirshfield, the poet, we were at her home in California, and it was just a poet's home. It was just what you would imagine a poet's home would be. A beautiful garden outside with vegetables and flowers, and a kind of writing, a shack, a little writing house that is filled with poetry books that have overflowed from her home. So it was really just absolutely just amazing. Andrew Sean Greer, whose book Les won the Pulitzer Prize in 2017, his home in San Francisco with his pug, who was just so much fun, would jump up and sit on our laps while we were talking. That was, and partly I think meeting the authors in their homes or in a place that's very special to them. We met Dave Eggers at the McSweeney's offices across from,
right.
The writing center that he and his wife set up. It puts the conversation on a different level, I think. And oh yes, we were at what is many people's favorite interview in the book is the one with Michael Chabon and his wife.
I was going to ask about that because you had husband and wife together in their home, and it was fascinating. It
was absolutely
fed off of each other, and it was so funny.
Yeah, it was just a hoot. And they live in Berkeley, not in the Berkeley Heights, but lower down. And we all sat around their kitchen table. They were eating peanut butter and banana sandwiches, which they offered me and Jeff, but we had already had lunch. So we were drinking tea, they were eating their sandwiches, and we just talked and talked and talked and talked. And these interviews, mostly we have about an hour, more than an hour of tape of these interviews. So we had to really edit them down. Russell Banks, who has his new book out, which is so, so wonderful. We interviewed him at his home in Saratoga Springs. It was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. And, we did it in the summer of 2019. So we got it done before everything shut down, because it would have been a very different book if we had to do it over Zoom.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
Yeah, I would think so too. I actually interviewed Russell Banks just last month for his book Foregone, which is an amazing book.
Yes, it is.
And he was in his home, very casually sipping wine while having a nice interview with me. And it was nice. I kind of felt at home with Russell Banks.
And one of the things in the interview with him, he talks about that he's rereading The Death of Ivan Illich. And he said he's rereading it because it relates to the book that he was working on, the novel that he was working on. And of course, if you read Foregone, then you see exactly why he was reading that wonderful, wonderful novella, The Death of Ivan Illich.
I'll have to read The Death of Ivan.
Oh, yes,
because I read Foregone. I was amazed by it. I was also puzzled by it, and so maybe if I read, that Ivan Illich book, I will understand it better. Get a little more in there. Another thing that I found interesting about the book, and each chapter is a different writer, so it's all nice and easily in its chapter forms. And I was impressed by how generous the writers were talking about their books and what inspired them. They really do love to talk about books. I mean, I can imagine I'm surprised your interviews only lasted an hour, because sometimes I sit and I think, oh my gosh, I know that you had edited a lot. So I just thought maybe they had gone for 2 hours, but really they're so generous. They love books.
They do love books, and they each have their own particular stories about discovering their love of reading. And someone like Dave Eggers, who is such a prolific writer and so generous with his time and generous in his philanthropy, doing things particularly for kids in the San Francisco area. And you think, I always thought that he was this kid who started reading at the age of 3, and then just never stopped. But it turns out that no, Dave Eggers was dyslexic, and he was not a reader. He was one of those kids who ran around the house, didn't read. And he said, really the first book that turned him into a reader, the book that turned him into a reader was Frank Herbert's book, Dune. And that was in high school.
Yeah.
And that when you think about that, and you think about Dave Eggers, I mean, it's like hearing people talk about the books that made them the people that they are, gives you a different insight into them as writers, but also as human beings. Sorry.
You always started many of the interviews with them asking about about their childhood reading habits, in a sense, like were they big readers,
Right.
or did their parents read to them, or and so you do feel that's a significant start to a writer.
I do. And, I was a children's librarian for many years. And I think that when we were doing these interviews, I guess I should say, we didn't have a planned list of questions. If you read the interviews, you'll see that every interview goes in its own direction, that we didn't ask, we had certain questions that, we thought would come up. But we began, I think, almost all the interviews with me saying, so were you a big reader as a child, or something like that? But then however the writer wanted to take us, we let that writer take us in that direction. So Jonathan Lethem talked about, working in used bookstores in the Lower East Side of New York. I guess not the East Side of New York, but all those used bookstores, and beginning his collecting books when he was just a teenager. And Louise Erdrich talked about how when she was a kid, her parents were both teachers in North Dakota, in their little town in North Dakota. And she said when she was a kid, she looked up at the top, at the top of a bookcase in their home, and she saw this book, Marjorie Morningstar, and she said she just felt like, I gotta read that book, and climbing up on a chair to take it down. Well, I mean, I'm not sure that there's under any other conditions would Louise Erdrich have talked about Marjorie Morningstar and and her reading of that, and talked about also her little library, her little public library, and how important that was to her.
Yeah, and I was also surprised how many of them said Watership Down in their childhood was so important to them. And I have that book now. I took it out of the library. I'm going to read it. Watership Down. I think more, maybe half of them said Watership Down was their big childhood book.
Absolutely. I mean, that was mind-boggling, because it was everyone from Michael Chabon to Madeline Miller, the author of Circe and Song of Achilles. And Madeline Miller talked about how when she read it, and the Madeline Miller interview is really interesting too, I think. It was just fascinating. And we were in her home with her two little young daughters. And I just thought that was so much fun. So Madeline Miller said that she read that book, Watership Down, as though it were like a heroic quest, like a quest novel. And even back then she was interested in that kind of the heroism or not of Achilles, and all of the classics that she has done so much with to reawaken our interest in them. That was great. I remember when we were leaving, Madeline Miller's older daughter, who I think was maybe 4, her husband had taken them away during the interview upstairs, and then they came down to say goodbye. And her older daughter said to me, she said, "You're old, aren't you?" I said, "Well, yes, I am old. That's true." She said, "Oh, I could tell by your hair." So I thought that was really fun.
Children are honest, aren't they?
Absolutely. And we love them because they're honest.
So now not that you play favorites or anything like that, but which interview was your favorite? Not necessarily who was your favorite writer, because I know you say right in the book that Russell Banks is one of your favorite writers. But I was like, which interview was like the most amazing, or like it just like, wow?
I'm so glad you put it that way, most amazing, or like, wow, because I have to say, in all honesty, every interview, when Jeff and I left, we would look at each other and we would say, "Oh my gosh, that was amazing." I mean, everyone had its own distinct appeal to us. Siri Hustvedt, we were at her home in Brooklyn, and just Siri Hustvedt first of all, her novels are just fabulous, and she is probably one of the smartest people that I have ever met in my entire life, and
Very strong person.
very strong.
Very
And
strong. I was.
yeah, she I mean, we left, it was like an exhausting hour and a half, because it was so intense, and listening and trying to keep up with this brilliant person who's sitting across the table drinking tea with you, was just like, oh my gosh. Amor Towles, as I said, was really just a fascinating interview, because he's such an interesting man and he's such an interesting reader. And another person who was so smart.
Well, he's such a student. He has a book group that actually was sort of a very selected kind of a book group. And I don't mean to say selected in any kind of a elitist way. It's just these people found each other that really enjoyed talking about books. And so they formed and meet at, I can't remember, is it once a month or every other month?
Right.
And they theme their a whole year of just a theme of books about housewives or something, and they read intensely. And then books about, the Southwest, and they read intensely for a year. I found that amazing.
I found that, I just found the description of that book club, book discussion group, which only has, I think, 4 or 5 people in it, was just a kind of daunting. I thought, oh my gosh, I don't know if I could ever do anything like that. But he, it was just, when we interviewed him, I had just finished reading all of the Rex Stout, Nero Wolfe mysteries. I rereading them, and I reread them in publication order, so I could sort of see how Rex Stout developed the characters of Nero Wolfe and Archie Goodwin. And I guess that came up in the interview. And he said, oh, he had read those. He was a big fan of Nero Wolfe as a detective. So that was really interesting. Maaza Mengiste, the African-American, Ethiopian American writer, her story of growing up in a war-torn Ethiopia, her family leaving the country to come eventually to the United States, to the Denver area, and seeing snow for the first time, and how that sense of leaving a place and leaving a war behind you really influenced the things that she was interested in as a child, are the things that she's writing her novels about, which I thought was so interesting. Laila Lalami, that was an interview in her home in Santa Monica, and it was the most political, I think, of the interviews, because her books are political, and what she reads is, has a political dimension to it. Viet Thanh Nguyen, I mean, I could go on.
You could go on and on.
Right. It was just Richard Ford. Now there's Richard Ford, that was a wonderful interview at his home in Maine, and talking to him, who knew, oh my gosh, who grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and knew Eudora Welty, Miss Eudora.
Yeah, she lived right down the street.
Yeah, right. And and hearing these writers talk about other writers that they admired, or that they, felt had influenced them. It was just such a, for a reader, and I'm a reader first and foremost, for a reader, it was like being, having a little bit of heaven, just being able to talk to Michael Chabon, and him saying, oh, I love this book, and me say, oh my God, I love that book. And then talking for a little while about what we liked about the book, or Ayelet Waldman, Ayelet, his wife, saying, now, what was that book? And, about the tarot cards, and me being able to say, oh yeah, that was blah, blah, blah. 9 Princes in Amber. So it was great fun.
I just want to say to, I saw someone with their hand up. This is just a little housekeeping. And I clicked on it and it went away. I think if you were to just go into the Q&A and type in your questions, then I will be able to read them out loud to Nancy. And so the Q&A, you can find it right down in the bottom of your screen. It's over, it says Q&A. Just click on that and you can type in your question. She and I will both be able to see it, but she'll be probably talking more about the book, and I'll be able to get those questions to her. So I'm sorry, whoever did put their hand up, I'm sorry, I clicked on it and it went away. My apologies. So Nancy,
Yes.
we have here at the library, we have a lot of people who are very interested. They're avid readers, but they also want to be writers. And I don't know if they necessarily want to be published writers. It's just that they love the whole environment about books and writing and words and how do they do that, and oh, that was interesting, and my gosh, I feel so great after that book, or oh, that book was devastating, and they feel very much that they want to try their hand at it. And so, I think that was also another question that you asked these writers. How were they influenced by books? Who influenced them? And there were some other crossovers of writers as well, not just Watership Down, that inspired them to just see that there's a world to write about. No, there were other writers that inspired them.
I think that goes back to where we started our discussion with that Senegalese proverb about when someone dies, their library dies. We talk, it's described as their library burned down. Because I think that when you read a book that you love, that book becomes part of you. And I know when I was writing my novel, and I certainly never thought at the age of 70 that I would sit down and write a novel about a teenager and her subsequent marriage, the first 10 years of her marriage. I was so influenced, not that my book is anything like these other books, but for me, writers like Ann Tyler, for example, her books published in the 70s and 80s especially were just sort of part of me by then, and I knew, and I think this is what the writers meant, that you know the kind of book you want to write because of the books that you have loved to read. And I remember Ernest Gaines, who we brought to the Seattle Library many years ago, and someone asked him, do you have any advice for writers, people who want to write? And he said, yes, I have 8 words of advice. Read, 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 write, 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 write. And I think that is still so true and so applicable. But I also think that for people who want to write, and I think some of the authors talked about this a little bit, for people who want to write, you have to write for yourself first. You have to write the kind of book or the kind of story or the kind of play that you want to read. You can't, the times when there's nothing that will tie you up in knots faster than writing for what you imagine publication would be like, or even, you just have to write a book for yourself. And to me, that was enormously freeing, because that's in the end what I did, is write exactly the book I love to read, the kind of book I love to read. But I think that's what writers do. And I think Jennifer Egan, for example, Jennifer Egan, we were at her home in Brooklyn, and she took us upstairs to her library, and she arranges her books in this really interesting way. She puts all the books together that she used to do research for whatever book she was working on. Now, isn't that fascinating? I mean, I thought that was so interesting. So when she was working on her, her newest book, there was all of this World War II and Brooklyn Naval Yard and all of that stuff. All of those books were together. And for the new book that she's thinking of thinking of writing, which is about America in the 18th century, or maybe 1800s, I guess, early 19th century. She had started to collect books about that. And so I think that's part of what it takes to be a writer.
Yeah. Now, of all the writers that you spoke with for the book, there were some that were very much influenced by other writers. And can you remember, I mean, there were some that they mentioned, one or two or three that were the big ones that really influenced all of them.
Well, an author who came up very frequently was Ursula Le Guin. And Ursula Le Guin, one of my favorite interviews in the book, and we haven't mentioned him yet, is Louise Urrea, who just told us wonderful stories about Ursula Le Guin, who was his teacher and who was really directly responsible for his first book being published. And Ursula Le Guin, of course, wrote adult books of fantasy and science fiction. I mean, they're always shelved there. They're really, I don't like these genre divisions because it takes it out of the main fiction collection. And I think ghettoizes different authors. But Ursula Le Guin would call him Luisito. And she would say, Luisito, do not write about women that way. Or Luisito, you must do this. And she's an author who has had been a huge influence to many writers besides Louise Urrea.
Yeah. Another was Laurie Moore.
Yes, Laurie Moore. Oh my gosh, Laurie Moore. Jeff and I read very differently. He mostly reads dead white men, or white men who were living at one time but are now dead. But one of the writers that we absolutely agreed on, and the hardest part was choosing what writers we were going to interview, because we needed to agree, and there was a lot of, it never came to blows, but there was a lot of horse trading. I'll give you this author if you give me that author, that kind of thing. But Laurie Moore was an author that we both really wanted to interview so bad, because we both loved her shorts. Both of us loved her shorts. I have to say, if you have
lost your mic.
Oh,
something's.
Can you hear me now?
Now can hear you. Yes.
Okay. So, and if someone out there has not read Laurie Moore's short stories, Birds of America, that is where I would begin. It's just a fabulous collection. But Laurie Moore, when we got in touch with her, said that she really didn't do anything in person. She would do an interview, an email interview. And this was right at the beginning. And Jeff and I really wanted to just do authors in person. We thought that was really important. So reluctantly, we didn't do her, which I now feel like that was a big mistake. We also really
think that Laurie Moore's short stories were so highly regarded by the other writers. Was it just that she's just such a good short story writer and it was the construction, or?
I think Laurie Moore is one of the best, word for word, sentence for sentence. It's hard to beat a Laurie Moore short story. Okay. She is the kind of writer, if you're the kind of reader who loves what you would call well-written books, if that's the most important thing to you, then Laurie Moore is the kind of writer I think that you want to pick up. And for me, it's her short stories that have really always been, I mean, that collection, Birds of America, I remember when it came out, had a gorgeous cover in addition to everything else. And it was just just the kind of short stories that if you are interested in being a writer, here you have this master writer in Laurie Moore.
And another name they brought up a lot was John O'Hara. And I just grabbed a number of his books to try to read up on his.
Now, I think that probably was due to the fact that John O'Hara is another writer that Jeff and I both love. And we both love his collection of novellas called Sermons and Soda Water. And so, you know, Jeff's two favorite writers, well, his favorite writer is Philip Roth. And I have to say that every time that Philip Roth came up in this interview, a collection of interviews, partly it was Jeff bringing it up, you know, because he let any kind of discussion go by without talking about Philip Roth. And partly because there are writers here who just think, who thought Philip Roth was a wonderful. Susan Choi, for example, is a huge Philip Roth fan. So, and I think with the John O'Hara, I think that partly was the kind of recency bias, and that Jeff and I probably brought up John O'Hara. But again, John O'Hara's collection, Sermons and Soda Water, which has been, many of his novellas have been reissued by, I think, Every Man's Library, Random House. You know, those are fabulous. I mean, when I think about novellas that I love, Sermons and Soda Water is the kind of best collection of novellas. And the title, of course, comes from a poem that says, "Let us have wine and women, mirth and laughter, sermons and soda water the day after." So that's always been, I've always liked that as well.
So I have another question from an attendee who is asking, Christina is asking, thinking about his humorous writing style, she's curious to know if T.C. Boyle is super funny in person.
Oh my God. Yes, T.C. Boyle is a hoot. And so the day started when we went to Montecito to interview Tom Boyle. He, you know, to get into his like compound, I guess, you know, you had to pick up a phone and call into the house. And so Jeff and I, like the sibling, like as though we were really siblings, started squabbling about who would call Tom Boyle, you know, to say we were here. And Jeff said, "You call him, Nancy, you know, he knows who you are." I said, "You call him, Jeff, you interviewed him, you know, most recently 10 years ago." And so we're standing there squabbling, and the gate opens and Tom Boyle comes out and says, "Oh, the phone is broken. Don't worry, you know, come on in." And then, as you can read this in the interview, but we're talking about his book about his not his most recent novel, but the one about Timothy O'Leary and LSD. And I said, you know, boy, those descriptions of those LSD trips sounded so real, Tom. And he said, I said, I thought they were really interesting. He said, "Oh, I'm glad you think so, Nancy. I put a tab of LSD in your Pellegrino."
Oh, that's right.
So he is that kind of person. I loved him. Yeah, I loved him. He was fabulous. Just so, yes, he is very funny, but oh my gosh, what a reader. And what a wide collection of books that he has in his personal library. And one of the books that he has was one of my one of my favorite novels, which is called The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, which came out probably in 2015. I think it was one of the finalists for the Pulitzer. And it's just an amazing novel. And he had it on his bookshelf. And so when you see that a writer that you admire also admires a writer, a book, loved a book that you loved, I mean, that's what makes connections, I
Yeah.
think. That's that's the best part of being a librarian, is being able to meet people who love books and reading as much as you do.
Mhm.
That was always, for me, the best part of doing readers advisory work.
Yeah, I actually love it. It's my favorite job I've ever done is the reader advisory and talking with people. Just being with people is fun.
Right. Yes, totally.
So some other things that that is actually an interesting thing I read in a number of the writers brought up something that's also kind of being talked about today about this audience, this authentic voice. And they touched upon it. Louise Erdrich did, as did, I'm not sure if I pronounce his name correctly, Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Viet Thanh Nguyen, and Laurie Frankel
Yes.
brought it up as, you know, it was interesting. And I didn't know if the other writers had, but it's just not in the interviews.
I think that voice and an authentic voice is the way, sort of back in the day, people used to talk about show, not tell. That's, if you're writing fiction, show, don't tell. But now it seems as though the main thing that we're hearing about is voice, and having to get the voice of the narrator or the voice of the characters,
To be authentic.
authenticness of it, the authenticity of it. I don't think for Viet Thanh Nguyen, who came to the United States from Vietnam when he was about 8 years old, into a Pennsylvania town, a smallish Pennsylvania town. What does that mean? What does that authentic voice mean? Certainly it means, in his book, The Sympathizer, that he's writing about Vietnamese, and main character is Vietnamese. But that authenticity, I don't think it means that you only have to write about somebody who is just like you, because you're writers, and that's your talent, that's your kind of superhero-dom is understanding other people, being able to inhabit the lives of other people. So to talk about an authentic voice, maybe it's something like the voice has to be what that character would sound like.
Yeah, Louise actually was very sensitive growing up on the Indian reservation, and having all of her relatives, and not seeing books that were like her, though
Right.
she loved reading the stories. But she did say she got into sci-fi because there wasn't really an identifier other than these aliens, outer space, or that they were going to a faraway place that wasn't a familiar place.
Right.
So therefore she got into sci-fi. And it wasn't until, I think, one of her uncles, I think it was, or her, wrote a family history, and all of a sudden, just the way he was writing it, she could see her family, she could see the environs. I thought that was such a sensitive
Yes.
thing. So so that was, to me,
yeah.
Anyway.
And I think that that's certainly what we want to aim for in library collections. And I think particularly of children at this point, and how important it is for children to come to the library and find books that they recognize themselves in. And I've always believed that a child should be able to come to the library and find himself or herself on the pages of a book, and lose himself or herself in the pages of a book.
Yeah.
That's the goal. And you know, I think that we're doing certainly a much better job of that as librarians, of making sure that our collections are diverse in that way than we did when I was growing up, for example.
Yeah.
So
It was just an interesting, it was a very interesting topic because they all came at it in different ways. It's a very big topic, very big, and it's interesting. So you had one poet in the book.
We did, Jane Hirshfield.
And how different that chapter was. Really, just a different frame of mind.
Yes.
So interesting.
Wasn't that interesting? Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up, because talking to Jane Hirshfield, it was, you could see as she was talking that every word meant something to her. You know, it wasn't that there were wasted words in her answer. She was very, very thoughtful. When we finished the interviews and we, you know, I mean, the hardest part was trying to transcribe those interviews. I thought I would go insane trying to do that. And finally, thank goodness, we found somebody who could who could take them and transcribe those interviews, because I don't think there would be a book if I had to do it. It was like a crazy thing. But when we you know, cut down the interviews to the number of words that we needed, we sent the interviews back to each of the writers so that they could go over it and they could make any changes. You know, they could add whatever if they wanted to add or they wanted to take out. And some of the writers really did quite a bit of rewriting their interviews. Rewriting in the sense of you know, adding authors, or just saying, oh, I wasn't very clear here, let me make that a little clearer. You know, it wasn't like these were news stories or anything that we're going to be hot off the press. You know, this was a collaboration between me and Jeff and the writers, and we really wanted the writers to be very happy with the interviews. And some of the writers did a lot of that tinkering with what we said, and Jane Hirshfield was one of those writers. And I think I could have predicted that, because with Jane, and plus Jane is a Buddhist, and so all of her answers are sort of couched in that belief, which comes through so beautifully in her poems. I mean, her poems are just wonderful. And, you know, I wish we had room for another poet or two, because that would have been so interesting to do.
In one of the recordings that I had seen you and Jeff speaking together, maybe there'll be a poet's library, like there's the writer's library, that maybe you'll do a poet's library.
I mean, Jeff thinks he would love to do, you know, he would love us to do something like that. I feel like if we were going to do something, I'd like to do children's authors, but Jeff is, you know, doesn't have children, and is not really interested in children's writing. But you know, I would love to do a collection of interviews with children's writers. I think that would be really fun.
Another attendee named Norma has asked actually a great question, because about, first the question is, Nancy, how do you pick what to read next? And how often do you reread? And it was interesting in this book, how many writers reread all of their favorite books. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh, so, you know, as I said, this was finished before 2020, before the pandemic. So I think for many of us, our reading changed significantly during the pandemic. I know that mine did. I have always reread a lot, often, but during the pandemic, what I was really looking for were those comfort books that I had loved and would take me away from where the world was at during 2020. So I did a ton of rereading during 2020, but I also discovered a British publisher called Dean Street Press, and they are reissuing tons of novels that come from the golden age of mysteries, British mysteries, the 1920s and the 1930s, and women writers, mainly women writers of mid-century, mid-20th century. And I think Dean Street Press got me through the pandemic, because writers like Marjorie Sharp. Now, people might know Marjorie Sharp because she wrote The Rescuers, Miss Bianca, but she also wrote about 30 adult novels. And I read every one that I could find. I got them all, the ones that Dean Street Press had reissued. Stella Gibbons, who wrote Cold Comfort Farm, which was a book that I just absolutely loved. She turned out she'd written many other books, novels, and so I have been going through all of those as well. But Dean Street Press also reissued a lot of mysteries from that period, and those I found were really comforting to me. Now, the way I find good books to read are books to read. I'm very lucky that publishers send me copies of books in advance because they're, would love for me to talk about them on NPR. So I, go through all of those and look at all of those and try many of them, but never feel compelled to either finish a book that I'm not enjoying, or, I'll read the first page or two and see of almost anything and see whether it meets what I'm looking for, which is really good writing and characters that I not necessarily like, but characters that I believe in, that I believe are real, that I have, that I get, I think is a good way of putting it. I don't pay any attention to the reviews on Amazon. I don't pay any attention really to most book reviews, because really the thing is that we each read a different version of a book. We don't read the same book, even though we're all reading the same book for a book. But we each bring to every single book that we read who we are right up to that moment that we open the book and start reading. And all of our experiences, of course, are different from each other. So when I say I loved the book, I love Laurie Moore's collection of short stories, I read those short stories with every one of my experiences, with who I am, which is very different from who anybody else is, who Laura is. And so really, that's what makes book groups so interesting to me, book discussions so interesting to me, is that we're all reading different versions of the same book. And Paul Auster, who is Siri Hustvedt's husband, who's a novelist and essay writer, in one of his essays, he talks about, in every novel that he writes, he leaves room for the reader. And so that the reader, that particular paragraph in this essay ends with him saying, so in the end, I believe that each book is written by the writer and the reader collaborating on the book that the reader is reading. And I totally believe that. But this is a long ways around, but two book reviewers that I really have a lot of respect for, and I pay attention. I don't always agree with them, but I pay attention to, what they're saying, and I agree with them frequently enough so that I feel good about myself, are two writers who write for the Washington Post, Ron Charles, who's the editor of the book section of the Washington Post, and Michael Durda, who who has written about books and just does a great job does a great job talking about books. So Ron Charles, I always love it when I agree with him, or when we both love the same book. And Ron Charles also loved The Woman Who, The Woman Who Lost Her Soul, which is the book that Tom Boyle and Viet Thanh Nguyen all liked a lot. So,
Uh,
so, you know, basically back in the day when the Seattle Public Library was open, I would go and browse the shelves to look for something to read. These days, I sort of look at my bookshelves and look at what comes in the mail and pick out what to read.
Yeah. So I just wanted to let you know, someone in the chat has said they would love to see a book with writers and illustrators of children's books. So not what Jeff wants to do, but what you would like to do. You have another vote for that. And then Virginia Stanley, who is with HarperCollins, she has just sent in 2 questions. She says, "Hi, Nancy. It's been an honor having your book under Harper's roof. I love the Writer's Library. I also love your novel, George and Lizzie, which Harper did not publish. But can you talk about the experience of writing that novel and what other stories are in your head? Sending much love to you," she says.
Oh, Virginia. One of the wonderful parts about being published by HarperCollins was being able to work with Virginia, who I've known for many, many, many years, and she's just wonderful. So George and Lizzie came about in a very strange way. I had foot surgery, and the doctor had given me oxycodone for the pain, and you know, the doctor said take one every 4 to 6 hours when you get home, and so I did that, and you know, so about 11 o'clock at night, you know, I was going upstairs to bed, and my husband was standing behind me just in case I fell backwards. And I turned to him and I said, "This has been the best day of my life." and I, you know, I was lying in bed, just sort of thinking about what a wonderful day it was. And these 2 characters came into my head. And one was, I knew immediately, one was named George, the other was named Lizzie. And I knew very little about them at that moment. And over the next 2 or 3 years, I just thought about them all the time, and they became so real to me. And one day when I couldn't find anything to read, you know, all of us readers go through that time when you're looking for something and no book really matches exactly what you think you want. I thought, oh, well, I have George and Lizzie, and I could tell their story. That's the kind of book I want. And that was what made me sit down and start writing George and Lizzie.
Do you have other stories in your head now? I mean,
well, one of the minor characters in George and Lizzie is a guy named Maverick Brevard, and Maverick is intriguing to me because based on the timeline of George and Lizzie, he would be just about 50 today in 50 in 2019. And I see that Maverick has moved to Seattle, and I could write about him in Seattle and make fun of all the things that drive me absolutely bonkers about being in Seattle. So it would be funny, and it would be about what it's like to be 50 and feel like you haven't accomplished anything with your life. So
she has another question. Can you talk about your love for the book Baby Island?
Oh God, Baby Island, Carol Ryrie Brink. So Carol Ryrie Brink won the Newbery Award for a book called Caddy Woodlawn. I suspect many people read that book when they were children or have read it to their children. Caddy Woodlawn, wonderful Newbery Award winning book. It has some issues now, but we don't have to talk about that. But another one of Carol Ryrie Brink's books is a book called Baby Island, about a boat that accidentally is shipwrecked, and 2 little girls rescue the babies who are on board, and there they are on this island trying to survive. And Baby Island is a book that Virginia Stanley and I both love, and I have an old library copy of it that I picked up at some used book sale at a library, and we always have this, like, you know how some people have like a secret handshake. So Virginia and I have a secret smile that we're both remembering how much we love Baby Island.
Great. So I'm going to now ask you the question that you asked all the other writers.
Okay.
Was your childhood surrounded by books? Did your mom and dad read books to you? What was your childhood like with books?
I grew up in Detroit, and I grew up in a home that had a lot of books. My parents were both readers, but it didn't feel to me as a child that it was a particularly safe place to be. And so I spent all my time after school, all day Saturdays, at my local public library, the Parkman Branch Library of the Detroit Public Library System. And I would walk there, or when I got a little older, I would ride my bike. And it was a librarian there, Miss Frances Whitehead, who really took this, miserably unhappy child that I was, and gave me the world. And it was because of Miss Whitehead that I became a librarian. I knew when I was 10 that I wanted to do for other children what Miss Whitehead did for me, which was really, save my life, I think, in a very real way. And, when I met Miss Whitehead, I was 8 or 9. That was when she started working there. And all I read was horse and dog books. And Miss Whitehead was Canadian and, had grown up on a diet of British children's fiction. And she wanted me to read all those wonderful British children's novels. And she figured out how to get me to move away from the horse and dog section in the library to other parts of the children's room in that library. And she would say to me, she would come up to me. I mean, I was there every day. I was there all day Saturday. I would be there at 9 o'clock in the morning on Saturday. I would leave, reluctantly at 5 o'clock at night. Miss Whitehead would frequently drive me home because, she knew I would, not go that way if she didn't drive me home. But she would say to me, Nancy, we just got a new horse book in the library. Do you want to be the very first person to read this book? I mean, my God, of course, like who wouldn't? Here's this brand new Marjorie Henry book. Of course I want to be the first person. So I would hold out my hands, for the book, and she would say, and this is the first experience of bait and switch that I ever was introduced to. I would hold out my hand for the book, and Miss Whitehead would say, oh, but wait a moment, Nancy, before I give you this book, how about reading this book I think you'll really love called Mary Poppins? And little by little, Miss Whitehead got me away from solely reading horse and dog books. And
are you saying librarians are tricksters?
I'm saying librarians can change the world.
There we go. That's right.
Saying libraries are the heart and soul of a community.
Yeah.
And they make the world a better place.
Nancy, thank you so much for being with us. The book, Writer's Library, if you can see, oh, I've got this crazy screen that, oh, well, doesn't it? So sorry.
Hold it up.
There you go. Yes, the Writer's Library. This is a wonderful book to read about all your favorite writers and really what makes them tick, and also just their personalities just come popping right out. And it's just fun to know them this way. Thank you again, Nancy, so much. We had so much fun talking to you and hearing about all the different stories. And what was best, I really loved hearing about your childhood story too.
Oh,
that was wonderful.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you everyone for coming. This concludes our program. I'm sorry, but it's past 8, so we're all done. Thank you all for coming.